Good morning. So today we are starting a new chapter on network security. And a lot of the applications that we have seen so far can run on the network, on the internet, because they usually have security in place. For instance, all the banking applications that run over our browsers and includes a client-to-server communication can run only because we have implemented security in there. Or most of the web browsing, most of the media applications can run because we have security. So cryptography is an important part of the security, and most of the time we implement cryptography to provide certain functions such as authentication, integrity, availability, and confidentiality. But when you tell people that you are doing cryptography, well, the first thing they say usually is, oh, I know cryptography, it's encryption. Well, cryptography is not only encryption. And in this lecture, we are going to learn other uses of cryptography for other stuff, things like authentication, integrity, and availability. Well, what's even worse is that today when you tell people that you're doing cryptography, they usually reply, oh, that's cool. Which coin should I buy? Unfortunately, the cryptocurrency's name became synonymous with the cryptography, and this is not really something good. Cryptography existed long before the cryptocurrencies, and modern cryptography existed for over 50 years. And cryptocurrencies is just, or rather blockchain is just one application of that. So security is not just about cryptography, though. We also have other security practices in transport network and link layers. For instance, you can deploy a firewall to block potentially malicious messages to your organization. Or you can insert an intrusion detection tool, which would detect anomalous packets, anything that has potentially malicious content, perhaps malicious comments that would cause the system to fail or have cascading effects into other parts of the system, can be detected by these intrusion detection tools. You can employ simple rules. You can have policies in your system that would detect and block such activity. Or you can have smart detection mechanisms, such as using machine learning and AI. But most of our discussion here in this chapter will focus on these cryptography practices. So this is our outline. We're going to start with the definitions of network security, what is confidentiality, integrity, misauthentication. Then I'll provide some historical perspective as to how these techniques were developed, starting from 2,000 years earlier, from Caesar cipher, then all the way to the Second World War and today's modern cryptography. So today's cryptography is very different than what we had before, in the sense that we now have a scientifically established base for cryptography, meaning we can prove that things are secure, at least an encryption scheme, at least the misauthentication scheme is provably secure. That is, of course, assuming that the implementation is also correct. Many times in practice, even if you have a perfectly secure scheme that has 10 pages of proof in a paper that this scheme is secure, if you implement it wrongly, let's say you chose the wrong key size, for instance, you chose a smaller key size, then it will not be secure, unfortunately. Or even if your implementation is perfect, there can be other errors that come with implementation. For instance, there are things called side channel attacks. Even if you have a perfectly secure black box encryption machine, I can perhaps measure the electromagnetic waves around that machine, and I can measure how much electromagnetic field and magnetic field does this machine generate while it is encrypting and when it is generating that. how much it is generating that. Perhaps with that information, I can devise something about the message you're encrypting. So what we are going to learn is mostly the theoretical side of cryptography, but these practical considerations are always there, and when implementing a system, a security engineer must always think about those. And then we are going to look at some of the applications that we have seen, securing the email and the transport layer security. Most of the web runs with. The S in the HTTPS is for the secure socket layer, or the new name is the transport layer security, or TSL. And perhaps if the time allows, we can have a look at the other practices like firewalls, perhaps blockchain intrusion detection systems, and so on. So let's start with a little experiment. I chose you, my volunteer. So can you write a short message and choose one of your friends and send that message to that friend? Or I can help you send it. So now we are simulating a scenario of two hosts communicating over an insecure network. Thanks. So let me fold it. Who do you want to send it to? Choose someone far. We are going to have it routed through the class. Okay. Can you look at us? Girl sitting in the corner? Okay, she'll know when we get there. So I folded it 3 times. And I want you to route all the way there. I can help wherever you cannot. Okay, I can do it. So this is just to simulate that we have routed it through a few nodes around the class, and he has chosen you. So can you read the message? Oh, okay. It takes some courage to say that. So did you actually write that message? No. What message did you write? Okay. Then what happened? Somebody must have swapped your message with some other message. That's right. And in this chapter, we are going to see methods to prevent such malicious activity. So let me go through one of the properties we want to provide with network security, and then I will ask you to guess which property should we had in place for his message to be accurately conveyed to her. So first we have confidentiality. Here, only the sender and the intended receiver should understand the message contents. But in our scenario here, you didn't encrypt your message. You just sent it in plain text. So anyone, including me and other parties that routed, that other intermediaries, could have read the message contents. Next, we must have authentication. So the sender and receiver want to confirm the identity of each other. So the receiver must know that the message is indeed coming from him, and you must ensure that the message is indeed going to her. We also have message integrity. Here, we want to ensure that the message is not altered in transit. So altering can be swapping the message. It can be forging a completely new message. Or it can be just dropping the message and perhaps sending the message at a later time, a replay attack, so to say. And another property that is not usually provided through cryptography, but in combination with other techniques, is the access and availability. So here the services must be accessible and available to all the users. You can think of perhaps the denial of service attacks. If I can send thousands of GET requests to a resource-constrained web server, then perhaps I can constrain the resources there, and because of the too much resources spent on replying to my HTTP GET messages, that server might be starved of resources to reply to other clients. So which one of these properties should we had in place for this message to be correctly delivered on the other party? It's one of these. Yeah, it's integrity. Sometimes in authentication, we can divide this authentication into two. One is the endpoint authentication. We shall see these later. So this is ensuring the identity of the other party in real time, in real-time communication. And the other method is message authentication. And this message authentication includes message integrity. So it is ensuring that the message is coming from the party that claims to be that party, and that message has not been altered in transit, both properties. But still, we need to define security. This is not enough. So when we say Alice and Bob want to communicate securely, it is not enough to say that we want them to communicate securely. In any case, in any system you're designing, you must always define the properties of security, be it confidentiality, be it authentication, be it integrity, and so on. And even there, you must define what the attacker can do. Here, the attacker could have swapped the messages, yes. But there are other things I could do. I could have dropped the message. I could have read the message. Or I could have simply added some characters to the message. Or I could have picked up the message and give that message to her tomorrow. So all these attack methods should be defined to define security first. But let's also go through our main scenario here. We have Alice and Bob. These are the parties who wants to communicate securely. Again, security needs to be defined. And there is an intruder, Trudy. So this is me in the previous scenario. And this Trudy may intercept messages, delete messages, add messages, can do lots of things. So Trudy sits on the network. Perhaps if it's a wired network, she can wiretap that network. Or if this is wireless communication, she could just listen to the radio waves. And we must have a security module here and another security module here so that even if an intruder sits in a channel, we could still establish certain security properties as desired. Okay? So you might then say, who might this Bob and Alice be? Well, just like Bob and Alice might be human users, like in our case, they can be two end systems in a web browsing scenario. Bob can be a web server, Alice can be a web client browser. Or they can be two friends mailing each other. So in that case, it could be their mail clients, or it could be a mail server and a mail client. Or even in more serious cases, they can be the parties in an e-commerce transaction. So perhaps Alice is uploading her credit card information to the web server to pay a certain amount. If the parties in between can read that credit card information, her bank account might get emptied, right? It can be a banking transaction. You could share your banking details, the banking password, the password that you access online banking with. And it could also be a DNS server. So DNS requires secure communication. So in that case, Alice and Bob may be such DNS servers in the presence of an intruder who wants to interfere with the DNS lookups. So the adversary might want to send wrong DNS results and direct the users to a phishing website, for instance. So when you write, for instance, you are accessing dbs.com.sg, all you wrote is the host name. That needs to go to a DNS server to resolve that name. And you will be replied with an IP address. If that DNS response is not secured, if you don't ensure the authenticity and integrity of that DNS query response, then an adversary might just hijack your DNS server and insert a false response with a false IP address that would direct your browser to a phishing website where you, in fact, enter your DBS password and think you are doing transactions, but on the other hand, somewhere else, the adversaries obtained your password and making transactions as they wish. So DNS security is also very important. Perhaps we could have security in the routers exchanging routing table updates in the border gateway protocol. Or it can be, Alice and Bob can be just machines. IoT devices that are sending data to each other. And if that data is not encrypted, your competitors in the industry might have information about your production line. Or if you do not ensure integrity, perhaps, then somebody can insert false data, false commands that would cause catastrophic events for your system. It can be an MRT. For instance, in the MRT, these trains are constantly communicating, not for all MRTs, but at least in the downtown line, the circle line, you've noticed that there is no driver, correct? So in those systems, the train is measuring its location and speed, and that train is also sending that data into a wayside access point. And these wayside access points lie along the railway. They collect data from all the trains, send those to the control center, and the control center decides where each train should be. So the control center calculates the so-called limits of movement authority. So it defines a region, at least a line, where each train can be, at what speed, at a given time. And those trains then receive that limits of movement authority information and limit themselves to those regions of the railway. If we do not ensure the integrity of such data, I guess you could imagine that how trains could collapse with each other. Yeah, so what can a bad guy do? Well, we discussed most of these. They can eavesdrop, intercept messages. They can actively insert messages and impersonate the source, imitate the source. They can hijack ongoing connection by removing the sender or receiver and inserting himself in place, such as in the DNS spoofing case. And they can launch denial of service attacks. And sometimes these denial of service attacks can be launched at so many locations that we call them distributed denial of service attacks. And the reason they are doing this at many locations is that because if, let's say, a web server can see that there are too many requests coming from a certain source, it can easily block that source and continue operation perfectly. But then if you are launching that attack at thousands of nodes distributed over multiple autonomous systems, perhaps using bot devices that you infected with malware earlier, then this is very, very hard to detect. And in blocking these attackers, you might also block some legitimate users who want to simply send a GET request to your server. So a lot of these things are not easy to prevent. I'm talking about denial of service attacks. And cryptography alone here is not the solution. But for the other types of attacks here, we can use cryptography in most cases. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So cryptography has a long history dating back 2,000 years to the Roman dictator Julius Caesar. We had Caesar's cipher. But it was more of an art rather than a science back then. Well, because obviously we didn't have computers back then, 2,000 years ago. And not many people knew how to read and write in the first place. So even a very simple encryption scheme, well, it's hard to say encryption to those. Let's say a message scrambling scheme could work because for most people it is even hard to read written text. So if you could just modify it a little bit, then that is usually fine. But modern cryptography, as we study today, is a scientific field, and most of the developments were in the past 50 years or so. So let's just leave aside the ancient definitions of cryptography or cryptology. What is modern cryptography today? So we can say that it is the scientific study of the techniques for securing digital information. Of course, a lot of the things remain undefined here. What is securing digital information in the first place? What security? And that needs to be defined in defining security for a certain application. So historically, it's been heavily used by military and intelligence organizations. But today, it's everywhere. It's in the web browsing, email, messaging, payments, banking, cloud applications, DNS, as we've discussed them. So now I want to, okay, let's first go through the language of cryptography. So a little bit of terminology here. So we have the plain text message. This is the message your classmate wrote. This is unencrypted, open message that anyone can read. And usually, in cryptography, the sender and the receiver have keys. It can be encryption keys, it can be some other keys, but they usually have keys. So I'm going to denote the key of Alice by KA, and the key of Bob by KB. So here we said Bob's decryption key, but it doesn't have to be a decryption key. Let's just call it key. Okay? Let's say Alice's key and Bob's key. This example is over an encryption, but to be generic, let's say they just have keys. Their keys can be different. Their keys can be the same key, depending on the scheme. And Alice will run an encryption algorithm, and Bob will run a decryption algorithm. So after running this encryption algorithm, this plain text will be converted into a ciphertext. So this is the encrypted form of text. So even if an adversary, a malicious intruder like Trudy or me in a previous example, could see that ciphertext, it won't be possible to derive meaningful information out of that ciphertext. And after decryption, these keys are set smartly. And after running the decryption algorithm, Bob will obtain the same plain text Alice has written. So again, M is our plain text message. Most of the times we will denote that with M. KA of M means encrypting that message with the key KA. And the result of that will be our ciphertext. And if you encrypt that message twice, once with the sender's key and once with the receiver's key, you should get the original message. That's how you set an encryption encryption key pairs. So now let's go to one subclass of encryption. We have symmetric key cryptography. And as the name implies, in the symmetric one, we have symmetric keys, meaning both keys are the same. We also have asymmetric key cryptography or public key cryptography we're going to see later. And there, the keys are different. So in this case, we have both keys denoted by KS, symmetric key or shared key. And after encryption, our encryption operation is KS of M, meaning we are encrypting M with the key KS. And our decryption algorithm, again, will encrypt that ciphertext with the same KS. And it's going to give us the plain text message. So then in symmetric key cryptography, there is one serious limitation, or let's say consideration here. So we first need to agree on a shared key. So Alice and Bob perhaps met each other earlier and agreed on a key to use in the future. But in the internet, most parties do not meet with each other prior to communicating. So once you want to connect to a web server, you cannot expect to meet that server's owner in person and agree on a key value. So if you want to use symmetric key cryptography, you must have a method of establishing keys prior to secure communication. And we shall see those methods later on. You could use public key cryptography, that is most of the, or asymmetric key cryptography to establish keys. That is most of how the networks operate today. Or there are some other methods like Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and we're going to learn about that too. Okay, so let's go back 2,000 years. So this is the simplest, probably simplest encryption scheme one might have. It's called Caesar cipher. So Caesar was the Roman dictator in about 40 to 50 BC, before century. And because Rome was a big empire, it had many legions, right? These armies consisting of thousands of men. And it also had a lot of municipalities. And you want to communicate, you want to give orders to these armies and municipalities. For instance, you can ask your legion to march to a certain city. But then your adversaries or your enemies can also capture your messenger and read your message. So you don't have networks, you don't have computers. You're sending the message using a messenger on a horse. If that messenger gets captured, your whole plan will be revealed. So what Caesar did is to invent this Caesar cipher, or simply shift cipher. So for every message, for every letter in the alphabet, we apply a certain shift value. So here in this example, A is shifted to X, B is shifted to Y, C is shifted to Z, and so on. So every letter is shifted by 3 to the left. So if in plain text, Alice wants to send this message, Bob, I love you, Alice, all she needs to do is to shift B with E, replace B with E, replace O with R, replace B with E, and so on. So in this example, the shift amount is just 3. But you could have any shift value ranging from 1 to 26, because there are 26 letters in the alphabet. So the maximum key size you can have with this encryption scheme is how much? 26. Well, maybe that worked at the time, because as I said, not many people knew how to read. And once they see that garbled message like this, they probably didn't understand anything and just gave up on it. But today, obviously, even we could figure this out without using computers. Well, simply you can just try all the shift amounts ranging from 1 to 26. It won't take long. But even better, you can do cryptanalysis, a simple form of cryptanalysis. For instance, in English vocabulary, there are not many single-letter words, correct? So once I see a single-letter word like this, I can guess that is the letter I. So if L is shifted to I, that means my shift amount is 3. I can try that 3 on the other letters, and if I see a meaningful message like this as my plain text, well, then that means I correctly guessed the shift amount with my cryptanalysis. So that is a very, very simple form of cryptanalysis. So obviously this is not enough. Well, good news is that we can improve upon that substitution cipher. And instead of having a fixed shift amount, we can have arbitrary shifts for every letter. In other words, we can map every letter in the alphabet to another one. So in this example, A is mapped to M, B is mapped to N, C is mapped to B, and so on and so forth. And now if Alice is sending this message, this is my ciphertext. It looks garbled again, but there are still not many possibilities. You can still figure this out without using computers. Again, you can guess these single letter words, that S is probably I, and perhaps you can also look at a longer text and see there are many of such letters. U, A, C. So let's say in a long text we have a lot of such letters, and I know that the word the repeats many times in the English. So I could guess that this is probably the, and I can decipher 3 letters from there on. And using that, I could reduce the possibilities and then try out the rest. With a mix of cryptanalysis and brute force trying, I could easily figure this encryption key. And from there on, of course, I can read any ciphertext message by converting it into plain text. Let's see how many possible key values here we have. What's the key size? Well, first off, I'm mapping my first letter, A, into any of these 26 letters, correct? Because there are 26 letters in the alphabet. So that gives me 26 possibilities. And let's say for my second letter, I can map it to any letter other than M. So I'm left with 25 letters. And for my next letter, C, I can map it to any letter other than M and N. So that gives me 24 letters, and so on. So that would give me 26 factorial possibilities, 26 factorial mapping possibilities, mapping combinations, and my key size is therefore 26 factorial. But this is, although this looks like a large number, again, first, it is not large enough for today's computers, and second, you can still perform cryptanalysis using combination of mathematics, statistics, and linguistics to decipher information. Well, good news. We can do even better. You can combine multiple substitution ciphers and use them cyclically. For instance, I could have n number of substitution ciphers. So each substitution cipher would look something like this. Random mapping of 26 factorial combinations. And I can apply these substitution ciphers one by one to every letter in my plain text. So for my first letter, I apply M1 substitution cipher. For my second letter, I use M3 substitution cipher. For the third letter, I use my M4 substitution cipher. And this goes on for the first 5 letters. And then I repeat the same for the next 5 letters. And I repeat the same for the next 5 letters, and so on. So this garbles the input more and makes it a little more difficult to decipher. So now we are getting towards the territory where it is not easy deciphering it without using a computer. So, yeah, just a simple example. If you're writing the letter, the word dog, you are obtaining the mapping of D from M1 you're obtaining the mapping of O from M3, and you're obtaining the mapping of G, the third letter, from M4, because this is the way they are ordered. So what is our encryption key here? What's the size of our encryption key? Well, we have n substitution ciphers, and we had a cyclic pattern for each of these substitution ciphers. Let's consider this example of having 4, let's write in the second page, yeah. Let's assume we have 4 substitution ciphers. And let's also assume we have a cyclic pattern of length 5. So it would be something like this, right? So I'm giving a letter here. So I have a substitution cipher, first one. I have my second one. I have my third one. I have my fourth one. And I have my fifth one. And it gives out the ciphertext. So we learned that for each of these substitution ciphers, we have 26 factorial combinations, correct? And I can order these 4 substitution ciphers any way I want, correct? So I can choose any one of M1 to M5 here for my first substitution cipher. So that gives me 5 possibilities. For the second one, I can do the same. I can reuse the same substitution cipher, or I can choose any other one of the 4. So I still have 5 possibilities. Sorry, I had 4 substitution ciphers. I have 4 possibilities. I don't have M5, I have M4. Okay. But I have 5 substitution ciphers in place, and I can choose any one of the 4 for each one of them. So I have 4 to the 5 possibilities there. And this gives me the size of my key. And as you can guess, sorry, as you can guess here, we are now not limited with the size of the alphabet, but we can increase the number of substitution ciphers and the types of substitution ciphers to have a larger key size. So I can have 100 substitution ciphers with cyclic patterns of 50, for instance. So this is a good way to go. We can increase our key size. We're not limited with the alphabet. But still, this is not secure in modern practices because it still allows cryptanalysis. So, any questions so far? Okay, so the pen and paper encryption worked in the old times because nobody was accustomed to crack codes. Not many people were reading, and there weren't many who really took that as a profession. They were mostly peasants, farmers, or soldiers. But now let's move towards more recent times, to the Second World War. And at the time leading to the Second World War, the scientists already knew that pen and paper encryption didn't work. And now we had people who are working on that full-time, mathematicians and statisticians. And they figured out that you could not just have very simple substitution ciphers. You could not have very simple, a little more sophisticated version of substitution ciphers. And they need something more complex. And Germany, during the Second World War, invented this Enigma machine. It is an encryptor and decryptor device. So in a Caesar's time, how do you obtain the message? Well, you could just intercept the messenger, kill the messenger, take their message. Well, in the Second World War, we do not have human messengers, but most of the communication goes through the telegram, these cables, and you could wiretap these cables to read the signals, or some waves were transmitted through radio signals. For instance, you cannot have wires to your ships, to your planes, and those commands, or to armies in remote locations, and those commands go through radio waves, electromagnetic waves, just like how we listen to radios. You could listen your enemy's radio waves and try to decipher their signals. So obviously, you cannot send the messages in plain text. So Germany devised this Enigma machine to encrypt their messages during the Second World War. So there has to be two Enigma machines, one at the sender side, one at the receiver side. So here the operator types the message in the keyboard, and it goes through multiple steps of garbling, so to say. So first there is a plug board. This is very similar to our substitution cipher. Each letter is mapped to another here. And then it goes through multiple rotating wheels. At first they had 3 wheels, but then Allies captured one Enigma machine, so they added a new wheel to make it even more complex. So these wheels are also like substitution machines, but with every message, they turn. So once I type one letter, they turn, and I have a completely different substitution. And each of them have different amounts of turns for every letter. So it looks very, very complex, and it seems at first glance it is impossible to crack. But the Second World War was not just won by Allied forces, not just with bombs and guns. It was also won with mathematics and statistics. So they figured out the inner workings of the Enigma machine, and later they captured one Enigma machine thanks to the Polish, I think. But the Germans were using a different code every day, different key value every day. So they had these huge code books. Remember, we have to share keys first in symmetric key encryption, and Enigma is an example of symmetric key encryption. So they have to change the key. They first agree on a key value in a huge code book, and every day they use that day's key value. And in the mornings, once that new key value is set, the Allied forces, led by Alan Turing, they devised a universal computing machine that could crack Enigma codes. They were running that machine on the new messages of that day today, and they were trying to figure out the key of that day. And once they do, a few hours later, then they could crack all the messages for the rest of the day. And how they did it? Well, they just used a combination of statistics. They performed cryptanalysis. They looked at perhaps the most common words in the German, and by using some complex mathematical techniques, they devised. That is not our subject, but the key here is that Enigma was not a scientifically proven secure machine. There's no understanding of modern cryptography at the time, and they were simply garbling the messages in a way to make it very hard to decipher. So that's the point. And why it is hard? Because the number of permutations was simply too large for that day's computers. At least that's what the Germans thought. So when considering how easy it is for an adversary, for a malicious party to break Bob and Alice's encryption scheme, we can distinguish, or we can think about three scenarios depending on what information the attacker has. Well, first is the ciphertext only attack. Here, the attacker only has the ciphertext she can analyze. So the message is encrypted into a ciphertext, and the only thing Trudy can analyze is the ciphertext. Here, she can just do brute force search through all the possible key values, or she can do statistical analysis. But there are other types of attacks which could improve the chances of the adversary. Well, one is non-plain text attacks. So here, the adversary knows the encryption of a given plain text message. So let's say I said the weather is very beautiful today, and I also encrypted that message. The adversary has access to both. And in the Second World War, the Allies also had access to that. For instance, they were also reading the weather reports and looking at how the weather is today, and also looking at the message and the ciphertext of that message. They could guess what the plain text is, and then from there, they are running certain analysis techniques to decipher that key. A more advanced version of known plain text is the chosen plain text. Here, the adversary perhaps has access to the encryptor machine, gives the machine any message, any plain text message she wishes, and obtains the ciphertext of that message. So here you can obtain many encryptions, many types of encryptions for all the messages you want. So this is a more advanced attack. And it requires access to the encryptor, or at least you can query the encryptor for certain messages. Okay. So based on what we have learned so far, we haven't learned about modern cryptography or modern encryption. We just discussed some terminology, that's all. But from there, we want to formalize the desired notion of security for symmetric key encryption. So this is what we are going to do now. So I want you to complete this sentence. And an encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can. Complete the sentence. And I'm going to give you a few options. And I want you to raise your hands if you think that definition is the correct definition for the notion of security for symmetric key encryption. So this is our first answer. An encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can find the secret key when given a ciphertext. So think about it. Do you think this is the right definition of symmetric key encryption? So who thinks this is the right definition? Who thinks this is not the right definition? Just raise your hands. Come on, you have to raise your hands. You cannot have no opinions. I have one hand. Again, who thinks this is the right definition? We have a couple of hands. Okay, let's write the numbers here. We're not judging anyone here, okay? Who thinks this is not the right definition? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Well, this definition of encryption completely misses the point. So the aim of encryption is to protect the message that is being encrypted. And the secret key is just the means for achieving that. So let's take this to an absurd level. Consider an encryption scheme that ignores the secret key. So there's a secret key inside, but it ignores. And it takes a message, and it outputs a ciphertext that is the same as the message? Well, you have no way of figuring out this key because that key is not even used. But the message is just outputted as the plain text message. So obviously this is not secure. Let's look at the second answer. An encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can find the plain text that corresponds to the ciphertext. Think about this, and I'm going to ask the same. Okay, who thinks this is the right definition? Who thinks this is not the right definition? No one. Okay. You yielded too early. So this definition looks better, yes, and you may find it on some text about cryptography, some formal texts, but it is far from satisfactory. Why is that? Well, if you're, let's say this is encrypting a message, correct? And after encryption, if it reveals, let's say, 90% of the plain text message and only keeps 10% hidden, according to this definition, it would be considered secure, right? Let's say I'm encrypting a document. So this is my encryptor with a message key. And after encryption, I just encrypted this part, and the rest is still visible. So you cannot find the plain text that corresponds to the ciphertext. You cannot read this whole thing here, but you can read 90% of it. So clearly this is not enough, right? To bring it to a concrete level, let's say this is an employment contract, a lot of text written in it, but the most important part is the salary. Let's say $1,000. And that part is not encrypted. It is still in plain text. So this is not enough. And that brings us to the third answer. Again, I'm going to let you think about it. An encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can determine any character of the plain text that corresponds to the ciphertext. Who thinks this is the right definition? Now you're more suspicious, right? So that's about 8, I think. Who thinks this is not the right definition? Two. Can you explain why do you think this is not the right definition? Gut feeling, okay. Just because I cheated you earlier. How about you? Can you explain? Well, but it is saying that you cannot determine any character of the plain text that corresponds to the ciphertext. So that is either encrypted or garbled, so you cannot determine any character. So I think that is not a valid point. Well, this, let's admit, this already looks like an excellent definition. And if you read over the internet, a lot of people will think that this is the right definition of encryption. And going back to our example of the employment contract here, now this whole employment contract is encrypted, so you cannot determine any character out of it. But it doesn't mean you cannot infer anything from the employment contract. So there is a salary information, right, in the employment contract. And maybe after this encryption scheme, you can still deduce that the salary is lower than $2,000 and larger than $500. This encryption definition does not cover that scenario. It can give still some information about the plain text without having to reveal any character of it, right? Any questions so far? Cool. So that brings us to a better definition. An encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can derive any meaningful information about the plain text from the ciphertext. Any meaningful information. Who thinks this is secure? This is the right definition. Who thinks this is not the right definition? I won't ask you to explain. Just raise your hand if you think this is not the right definition. Okay. So pretty much everyone thinks this is, at least no one thinks this is not the right definition. And I agree this is already very close to the actual definition, but it is lacking in one aspect. It does not define what meaningful information means. So again, we need to define everything perfectly. So meaningful information is your salary range, or it is the number of characters in the document. What's that? So this leads to a very important principle regarding definitions of security. The definitions should apply for all the potential applications. And let's go to the answer 5, and this is already a very strong guarantee. An encryption scheme is secure if no adversary can compute any function of the plain text from the ciphertext. So this provides a very strong guarantee, and when you formulate it properly, it is the right definition of symmetric key encryption. So we also explained what we meant by meaningful information by saying that no adversary can compute any function of the plain text. It can give you the length of the plain text. It can be the salary range in the plain text. It can be 5 times the salary in the plain text. You cannot reveal any function of the plain text. So this is the answer that is sufficient for us for the time being, but still, you need to define further depending on your application. For instance, does your system allow non-plain text attacks or non-ciphertext attacks? It depends. And if you're developing an application, if you're proving something is secure, you need to define all the powers of the adversary and all the properties you want to provide against that adversary. Any questions on the definitions of symmetric key encryption? Okay. So let us now move forward towards the modern times and see how symmetric key encryption is done today. Block ciphers themselves are not being used, but they are the building blocks of today's encryption schemes. So here, the message to be encrypted is processed in blocks of k bits. So if my message is long, I'm processing it in 4 bits, 8 bits, 16 bits, and so on. And the cipher is a one-to-one mapping of k bits to another k bits. So just like this. So here, the example is over k equals 2. We are processing in blocks of 2 bits. And I'm mapping 00 to 10. I'm mapping 01 to 11. I'm mapping 10 to 01, and I'm mapping 11 to 00. Well, how many possible mappings you can have? You can have all these 4 mappings. And this gives you the number of possible mappings of 2 to the k factorial, so that that term here is the factorial. But the problem here is that you have to store 2 to the k entries. So let's say this is my key here for k equals 2. I need to store all these mappings, right, so that I can encrypt any message, right? For every 0, 0, I'm converting it to 1, 0. For every 0, 1, I convert it to 1, 1. But as k gets larger, and to provide sufficient security, you need a larger k value, obviously. Your table size also grows exponentially. So yes, the attacker's job also increases a lot more than that, 2 to the k factorial. The number of possible mappings increases. But your table size also increases. So your key size would be too large, and this is not desirable. This would probably be secure in today's standards, but your key size would be so enormous that most applications cannot support it, or encrypting and decrypting a message would take a very long time. So let's say for k equals 64, that would, perhaps for sufficient security, we need k equals 64. And for a given mapping, Alice and Bob would need to maintain a table with 2 to the 64 input values. So table would have 2 to the 64 rows. And if I write that number here, probably I wouldn't have enough space in this slide. That many rows in a table. Yeah. So in practice, we do not use the block ciphers as they are, but we break the input into 8-bit chunks. So this is how we do it in the DES, the Data Encryption Standard and Advanced Encryption Standard. I'm just going through DES, which is not practically used today, but it was earlier used. And now AES is preferred, but AES is a little more complicated. So I'm just going through DES. So this is our, let's say, 64-bit input. I'm dividing it into 8-bit chunks, and I'm applying a block cipher for each of them, a different block cipher. And then I have a further scrambler here, and I'm outputting. Now my key size is much smaller, so I have a key size of 2 to the 8 for each of these. And this gives me my total key size. If you add them up, that is 8 times 2 to the 8. That is 2 to the 11, plus some bits for this scrambler. So as I said, DES was the earlier standard, but today we have the Advanced Encryption Standard, and this is the one that we use in the transport layer security, in secure mail, in banking applications, in cloud applications. Pretty much everywhere, this is the encryption standard being used. It processes data in 128-bit blocks. It can have different key sizes depending on the security level desired. And in comparison with DES, a brute force decryption that takes 1 second on DES would take 149 trillion years for AES for the same key size. So it is a lot more secure than DES, so many more combinations, and statistical analysis does not give you clues here. So you have to pretty much brute force the key value. Any questions so far? Okay. So for all the schemes that we discussed so far, starting from the ancient Roman times to Enigma to the symmetric key encryption of DES and AES, they all required two communicating parties to share a secret key prior to communication. And one difficulty with that approach is that, yes, perhaps today you can meet your friend and agree, but in the computer networks, that is not usually the case. And even in the Second World War, they used these huge code books that lists all the key values for multiple days. Today, we cannot establish them for all the clients and hosts in the internet. So we have to agree on a key on an insecure medium. So meaning that what I say to you can be listened by everyone else, but I still want to establish a key value with you, a shared secret key that nobody can know. So an earlier solution devised in 1976 is known as the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So these two guys invented that. And, well, we're not going through the details of that, but just to give you some flavors of it. So this is how it works. So we have Alice and Bob. They want to establish a shared symmetric key. They have a common value. I'm going to abstract it out with some paint color. Let's say that is yellow. This is not secret. So I can tell you that let's start from yellow. Okay, so this is the common paint that everybody knows. And I'm choosing a secret color. Let's say Alice chose orange. Bob chose whatever color that is, green, let's say. And they are mixing those colors. So now Alice had this light orange, and Bob had this blue. And they are sending these colors to each other using any secure communication channel. So anyone on the channel can read those messages, so anyone can see these colors. But that's not the problem here. And now they are again adding the colors that they added earlier. So Alice is adding the same orange, and Bob is adding that same green. And after you combine this orange and green color and the common paint that you started with, they both have this common secret that nobody knows, because nobody knows their secret colors. So in practice, this is a similar method by multiplying or taking exponentials of certain numbers. But just to get some flavors of it, this is how it's done. But as you could guess, Diffie-Hellman key exchange still requires you certain computations. You need to take exponentials, modular exponentiations, and you need to have a public transport that is secure, that has integrity protection, right? So if your blue color, when sending that to Alice, is changed to another shade of blue, let's say, this wouldn't work. So it still requires you to have integrity protection. So now we are going into the domain of public key cryptography, or this is also called asymmetric key cryptography. So in encryption, public key cryptography is usually used to establish secret keys first, but because public key cryptography is more expensive, it is not used to encrypt your messages, but it is only used to add integrity protection to your shared symmetric key, for establishing that shared symmetric key. And the earlier rendition of our public key cryptography scheme is invented by these three gentlemen, Rivest, Shamir, Edelman, and therefore it's called RSA by the initials of their names. So it is still being used in a lot of applications today. There is another public key cryptography scheme called ECDSA, or elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And together with RSA, they are all around us. For any application that needs to establish symmetric keys, or any application that needs certain integrity protection mechanisms, they use public key cryptography. So it is a radically different approach than Diffie-Hellman. And the sender and receiver here do not share their secret keys. Instead, they have two keys. Each of them have a public key that is known to everyone, and a private key that is known only to themselves. So this is how it looks like. So now we are talking about the keys of Bob. Again, Alice and Bob will have an encryption and decryption algorithm. But now Bob has this private key indicated by KB minus, and a public key that is known to everyone denoted by KB plus. So Alice also knows this public key. And for the message M, Alice runs the encryption algorithm, and that is encrypting the message M with Bob's public key, KB plus. And after obtaining this, Bob will decipher that message by applying his private key and obtain the plain text message from there. So what properties should we have? Well, that is, first property is that after we apply the public and private key sequentially, in other words, after we encrypt with the public and private keys sequentially, that should give us the original message. And another property is that no one should be able to obtain the private key by knowing the public key alone. So if we list those requirements, first of all, we need two keys, two key values, or a key pair, such that when encrypted sequentially, they would give out the original message, original plaintext message M. And given the public key, it should be impossible to compute the private key, KB minus. So now we are going into a little bit details of the RSA scheme to see how that works. And it relies on modular exponentiation. It is still a little bit of an expensive computation for most machines. It takes perhaps a few milliseconds to encrypt with the RSA key. And imagine encrypting so many messages. This takes a toll on today's computers. So what we typically do is that we first agree on a shared key using RSA. We securely send a key to the other party. And from there on, we both know a shared symmetric key, and we can use that shared symmetric key to encrypt our future messages. So let's go through the mathematics of RSA a little bit. So a little bit of a prerequisite. So we will be using this modulo operator here. And for addition, if you add A mod n and B mod n over mod n, this is equivalent to A plus B mod n. It is the same for the subtraction, and it is the same for the multiplication here. And from the last property, it follows that it also applies for exponentiation. Well, why is that? Well, you can think of this as A mod n d minus 1 times A mod n mod n this gives you a to the d mod n. So I just use the last property here, where my A is A, and my B is, oh, wait a second, sorry. This is here. Yeah, so I just applied the last property here, where my A is A, and my B is A to the d minus 1. Well, I can just use the same property here until I get to multiple A mod n's. So from there, I will have this property. So, you can try out a few values here and see that all properties work. So we will be using these properties, especially this last one here. So a message is just a bit pattern, but we can also think of it as an integer value. We can uniquely represent each integer with a bit, just like we can represent each bit with an integer. Therefore, encrypting a message is equivalent to encrypting a number. So if your message is this binary representation of a few bits, this can be uniquely represented by the decimal number 145. Well, why is that? Well, this is 2 to the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is 2 to the 4, 5, 6, 7. This is 2 to the 7. And if you add up 128 plus 16 plus 1, I get to 145. So an interesting information about decimal. This is not related to our topics, but now that we talked about Roman times. So do you know where the word decimal comes from? So it comes from the Romans. They used the decimal 10-base system, but the exact word is interesting. So if a Roman legion loses a battle because of their cowardice, what Romans did is that they let each soldier draw a stone, and most of the stones are white, some of them are black, and if a soldier chose a black stone, they would get decimated. Their heads are cut off. And this is apparently a lesson to the rest of the soldiers to not act on cowardice. And, that word of decimation got corrupted, and today we use it as decimal. So approximately 1/10 of each legion is decimated. So now we use the same decimal system to denote the 10-base system. So see how that word got corrupted. So anyway, the point here is that we can convert any binary representation into a decimal representation. And to encrypt a message M, we need to encrypt the corresponding number, which gives the new number of the ciphertext. So this is how we create public and private keys with RSA. We first choose two very large prime numbers. Each of them are 124 bits. And we also multiply them and compute n as their multiplication. And we also compute z as p minus 1 times q minus 1. So apparently, all of these numbers are very large, and p and q are prime. And n has only two factors, p and q, meaning n cannot be divided with a remainder of 0 to any number other than itself, and p and q, and of course 1. And then we also choose a e value that has no common factors with Z. That is, you cannot find any number that divides E and Z into an integer. So in other words, E and Z are relatively prime numbers. And we are also choosing another value, D. These E and D will be parts of our public and private keys. So we are choosing D such that ED minus 1 is exactly divisible by Z. In other words, ED mod Z equals 1. So if ED minus 1 is divisible by Z, ED mod Z is 1. And from there on, N is part of both the public and private keys, but your public key is N and E values, and your private key is N and D values. So you share this key with everyone, and this private key is kept secret. You don't tell D to anyone. So the property we want to hold here is that by distributing E, we are not giving out any information about D. Right? By distributing our public key, we're not revealing our private key. That's one property. And the second one is, if I encrypt subsequently with the public and private keys, I'll get the same message. So, given the public and private keys, as computed in the earlier slide, to encrypt a message, all I do is to calculate M to the E. You know, I'm encrypting with the public key of Bob. So encryption is just this modular exponentiation operation in RSA. And this is the primary reason why RSA is hard. Remember, E was a very, very large number. And if your message is also long, you have to compute its exponential of that much. You know, let's say this is 500 trillion to the 9 septillion. So this is a very, very large number. Although you have this modulus operation nearby, taking that many multiplications is very, very hard. So that modular exponentiation is difficult to compute. Well, when I say difficult, it means a few milliseconds in today's computers still. But you know, that aggregates when you do a lot of these computations. And you know, decryption is the same, but with the private key this time, with D. So you're taking this ciphertext, and you're taking exponential modular exponentiation of that ciphertext. And after that, RSA scheme guarantees that you will obtain the same plain text message. So just to give an idea of how slow it is, this is about 1,000 times or a few thousand times slower than AES to compute RSA. So why does RSA work? Can we go through this now? Let me see. Okay, I'm going to go through this later in the next lecture. Okay, any questions? Okay, I uploaded the tutorial on the multimedia chapter. You can give it a go, and I think next week I'm going to solve that. Yeah, see you on Friday.